The Battle of the Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, was a significant event in American history. Occurring on June the 25th to the 26th, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. It was a clash between the Lakota, North Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes against the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. George Herendeen, a notable scout during the time, played a leading role in the events up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. His expertise in navigating the terrain and understanding Native American tactics provided valuable intelligence to the U.S. Army. Herendeen's first-hand accounts offer unique insights into the complexities of the conflict. In the video, George Herendeen's tale of the Battle of the Little Bighorn will be recounted, shedding light on the pivotal moment in American history. His words will be transporting viewers back to that fateful day, urging them to delve deeper into the story American Old West Tale channel for a comprehensive understanding of this iconic event.
George Herendeen, a scout dispatched by General Terry with General Custer's unit, was tasked with carrying dispatches from Custer to Terry. We departed from the mouth of the Rosebud on June 22nd at noon, marching approximately 12 miles up the Rosebud and making camp for the night. The following morning, on the 23rd, we broke camp at 5 o'clock and proceeded up the Rosebud until 9 o'clock. At that point, we encountered a significant lodgepole trail, approximately 10 days old, which we followed along the Rosebud until evening when we set up camp along the trail. On the morning of the 24th, we departed at 5 o'clock and followed the trail for about 5 or 6 miles. At that point, we encountered 6 Crow Indian scouts who had been sent out by General Custer the previous night to search for the Indian village. They reported finding fresh pony tracks and indicated that the trail ahead was even fresher, about 10 miles ahead. General Custer gathered the officers around him, although I couldn't overhear their conversation. The scouts were sent ahead again at a brisk pace. We resumed our march at 1 o'clock, and while the officers were having lunch, the scouts returned, reporting that they had discovered signs of the village's recent presence. We continued our march, with flankers positioned well out to ensure the trail remained intact. Around 4 o'clock, we reached the site where the village had been just a few days earlier, and we made camp 2 miles downstream from the Rosebud Forks. The scouts once again set out to search for the village, and at 11 o'clock that night, Custer ordered everything to be packed up, following the scouts up the right-hand fork of the Rosebud. At daybreak, we set up camp, brewed coffee, and shortly after sunrise, the scouts informed Custer that they had spotted the village from the top of the ridge that divides the Rosebud from the Little Horn River. We proceeded up the creek until we were close to its source and took cover in a ravine. From our position, it was about 3 miles to the top of the divide, where the scouts claimed the village was visible. After concealing his troops, General Custer rode ahead with a few orderlies to observe the Indian camp. Within an hour, Custer returned, reporting that he couldn't spot the Indian village. However, the scouts, along with a half-breed guide named Nook Byer, also known as Mitch Boyer or Mitch Boyer, insisted they could clearly see it about 15 miles away. As Custer scanned for the village, the scouts returned with alarming news. They had been spotted, and word was spreading to the village about their approach. Another scout mentioned that 2 Sioux war parties had sneaked up and observed the command. Upon inspection of a nearby ravine, fresh pony tracks confirmed the report. Custer called his officers together, issued orders, and the troops prepared for battle. The scouts were sent ahead, and the regiment advanced at a steady pace. After traveling approximately 3 miles, the scouts alerted the command to the presence of Indians up ahead, and the unit followed their lead. Our path led us along a small creek, a tributary of the Little Horn River. After traveling about 6 miles, we spotted an Indian lodge in the distance, prompting Custer to quicken the pace. Upon reaching the lodge, we found ourselves in an abandoned Indian camp, with all the lodges except one having been recently vacated. Upon entering the remaining lodge, we discovered the body of a deceased Indian. From our vantage point, we could see into the Little Horn Valley and notice dense clouds of dust rising approximately 5 miles away. Many believed that the Indians were retreating, and it seemed that General Custer shared this belief because he sent a message to Colonel Reno, who was leading 3 companies of the 7th Regiment ahead, instructing him to quickly advance with the scouts toward the source of the dust. Reno led his men at a steady gallop down the creek bottom for 3 miles until they reached its confluence with the Little Horn River, where they found a natural ford. Despite the scouts' warning that the Sioux were approaching in large numbers, Reno decided to proceed and crossed the river. He then deployed his companies on the prairie in a battle formation and advanced at a trot, which soon escalated to a gallop. The valley stretched about 3/4 of a mile wide. To the left, there were low, rounded hills, and to the right, the river bottom was filled with cottonwood trees and bushes. Reno's skirmishers opened fire again after intermittent firing from the hills and a few shots from the bottom of the river. He then led his men about a mile from the ford to a line of timber on the right, where they dismounted to engage the enemy on foot. The horses were directed into the timber, while the men assembled on the prairie and moved forward towards the Indians. The Indians, riding their ponies, raced across the prairies and unleashed a barrage of gunfire at the soldiers. After exchanging fire for a few minutes, Reno retreated back to his horses in the timber. The Indians then maneuvered to his left and rear, seemingly aiming to block his access to the ford. Reno ordered his men to mount up and ride through the timber. Just as they were mounting, the Sioux, who had advanced within the timber, fired at close range and fatally wounded 1 soldier. Colonel Reno then instructed the men to dismount, which they did, but he quickly ordered them to remount and move out onto the open prairie. The command made a beeline for the ford, pursued closely by a large number of Indians. The pace increased with each passing moment until it turned into a full-blown sprint for the ford. Riding their quick ponies, the Sioux charged the soldiers, shooting and killing men and horses in the process. Little resistance was put up, and it turned into a chaotic retreat towards the ford. I wasn't present to witness what happened at the ford, so I can't provide details beyond knowing that many soldiers were killed when the command left the timber. Just as I was riding out, my horse stumbled and fell, throwing me off, and then bolted away following Reno's command. I spotted several soldiers who were also dismounted, either because their horses were killed or had fled. Some soldiers remained mounted, but there were about 13 of us altogether. Seeing no other option, I called on them to join me in the timber where we could try to fend off the Indians. 3 of the soldiers were wounded, with 2 of them in such bad shape that they couldn't use their arms. Despite their desire to leave, I insisted that we stay put. I explained that we couldn't make it to the ford, and besides, we had wounded men who needed our support. Some soldiers were still eager to leave, but I assured them that as an experienced frontiersman who understood Indian tactics, I could navigate us through the situation. I reminded them that this was no worse than other tough situations I'd been in before. About half of the men were on horseback and wanted to keep their mounts, but I urged them to let the horses go and fight on foot. We remained hidden in the bushes for about 3 hours, during which time I could hear intense gunfire downstream, roughly 2 miles away. I didn't know who was engaged in the fighting, but I could tell our men were in a skirmish with the Indians. Later I found out it was Custer's command. The combat with Custer lasted nearly an hour before the heavy gunfire subsided, with the majority of the Indians in the upper section of the valley retreating down the river. As the shooting subsided downstream, I urged the boys, "Let's go, now's our chance to escape." However, most of them chose to wait until nightfall. I warned them that the Indians might return and suggested we leave immediately. 11 out of the 13 agreed to go with me, but 2 decided to stay behind. I organized the men into skirmishers, and we advanced on foot towards the river. When we were close to the river, we encountered 5 Indians on horseback, and they fired at us. We returned fire, causing the Indians to retreat, and then we crossed the river, which was about chest deep. We made it across, the injured guys included, and proceeded to Reno's command, which I could make out a mile away on the riverbank bluffs. We reached Reno's position safely. After about 15 minutes or so with Reno, I noticed the Indians moving up the valley from Custer's battle. At that point, Reno began moving his entire command down the ridge towards Custer's location. The Indians, coming from all directions, crossed the river below Reno and poured up the hill. After engaging in skirmishes with them, Reno returned to his previous position, which was on one of the highest points along the bluffs. It was now around 5 o'clock and the battle continued until it became too dark to see and shoot. Once it was dark, Reno removed the packs and saddles from the mules and horses and used them to create breastworks. He also dragged dead horses and mules into position and used them as cover for the men. Some of the men used their butcher knives to dig rifle pits, and everyone remained armed and alert throughout the night. At dawn, the Indians initiated a heavy fire, leading to a fierce battle that lasted until around 10 o'clock. The Indians attempted to charge our position 3 or 4 times, even coming close enough to throw stones by hand at our men. Captain Benteen gave the command for his soldiers to charge on foot and scatter the large number of Indians who were assembling in front of him, ready to charge. Benteen took the lead in the charge, catching the Indians off guard and causing significant casualties. They seemed genuinely surprised by this aggressive action. In the midst of fierce combat, Benteen displayed remarkable bravery, moving fearlessly amidst the bullets. He continuously urged the soldiers to stand firm and not allow the Indians to overpower them. I neglected to mention that around 10 o'clock in the morning, shortly after Benteen launched his assault, the soldiers began urgently demanding water. Many of them had gone without water for 36 hours, and the intense fighting and hot sun had left their throats dry and parched. Some had swollen tongues while others could barely speak. They attempted to eat crackers and hardtack, but their mouths were too dry to moisten them with saliva. A few resorted to chewing grass, but it only stuck to their lips and none could spit or speak clearly. Reports emerged that the wounded were dying due to lack of water, prompting many soldiers to volunteer to fetch water from the river, even if it meant risking their lives. There was a valley that descended from the battlefield along the river's edge, and we were fighting on the bluffs some 700 yards from the river. To reach the head of the ravine, the men had to sprint across an open area of about 100 yards, which was under the control of the Indians positioned on the bluffs. Despite the danger, around 50 soldiers dashed across the open plateau and entered the ravine. They hurried down to the mouth of the ravine, only to find it heavily guarded by a group of Indians stationed in the timber on the other side of the river. While it was possible to approach the water to within about 30 feet under cover, stepping onto the riverbank exposed one to Indian gunfire. Nonetheless, the soldiers bravely ran through this perilous stretch. Some would rush down to the river with camp kettles, fill them, and then seek refuge in the bend of the ravine behind the rocks where canteens were filled and carried back up the hill. Before all the men and wounded received supplies, 1 man was killed and 6 or 7 wounded in the daring effort. One soldier had his leg bone shattered by a bullet, and it had to be amputated later. Around 2 o'clock, the Indians started withdrawing, but continued skirmishing until late afternoon. As dusk approached, they all retreated. Finally, we managed to fetch water for the animals, many of which were on the brink of death. They were then allowed to graze on the hillside. In the evening, Colonel Reno relocated his position to a higher and more fortified area, which was stronger than the previous one. We anticipated that the Indians would resume their attack the next day, but when morning came, there was no sign of them. Everyone was confident that Crook or Terry was coming to our aid, so Colonel Reno dispatched messengers. Around 10 o'clock, we received the joyful news that General Terry, accompanied by a sizable force, was advancing up the valley, just 6 miles away, and soon the lead elements of his troops became visible. I joined the scouts on the left side of Reno's formation. Our group consisted of around 60 individuals, including 35 Re-Indians, 6 friendly Sioux, 6 Crows, and the remainder white men. I witnessed Bloody Knife, a Re-Scout, raise his arm and collapse. I suspect he was killed. The 2 cavalry soldiers I left in the woods when I departed have likely perished, as they haven't been spotted since. I spotted Lieutenant McIntosh shortly after he was hit. His horse was shot from under him early in the skirmish, and when he was killed, he was riding another soldier's horse. He was shot on the riverbank while heading back toward the ford. I witnessed Lieutenant Hodgson as well. His horse got shot and he got hurt. Near the opposite bank of the ford, his horse tumbled into the river. To pull himself up the steep bank, Hodgson grabbed onto a horse's tail and managed to climb up. However, as he reached the bank, an Indian sharpshooter shot him down. Custer's packs were among the rest, and the Indians didn't seize any of them. Nor did they capture any mules. Most of Custer's horses were shot during the battle, and I doubt the Indians got more than 100 animals from the fight. I believe some of our men were taken captive and subjected to torture. I witnessed the colored scout Isaiah Dorman, being tortured. He had small pistol balls lodged in his legs from the knees down, which I suspect were fired into him while he was still alive. Another man had strips of skin carved out of his body. Groups of women and elderly gray-haired Indians were wandering the battlefield, shrieking wildly. The women wielded stone mallets and crushed the skulls of the deceased and injured. Many victims were slashed with knives, and some had their noses and other body parts severed. The Sioux camp contained the severed heads of 4 white soldiers, but their bodies couldn't be located on the battlefield or in the village. Our soldiers didn't kill any women, but the Indian scouts did. The bodies of 6 women were discovered in the nearby ravine. I estimate the Indian village housed around 6,000 individuals, with about 3,000 of them being warriors. The Indians initially engaged with Reno's forces, then moved on to confront Custer, and later returned to confront Reno again. The same group of Indians participated in all the attacks. I believe Sitting Bull personally led the Indians, with 8 or 9 other chiefs present on the battlefield. I witnessed 5 chiefs, each brandishing a flag for their troops to rally around. Some flags were red, others yellow, white, and blue, and one was black. All the chiefs managed their warriors skillfully. I believe Crazy Horse and his group were involved in the battle. The Indians likely suffered casualties comparable to those of the whites. Custer's men put up a fierce fight and undoubtedly inflicted heavy casualties on the Indians. I don't believe a single man survived from Custer's contingent. They were completely encircled by at least 2,500 warriors from all sides.